Welcome back for part 2 of our video series on how to develop more reflective composition students. I'm back again with Kathy Levine. Thanks for joining me again, Kathy.
No problem, my pleasure.
And in this part, we're going to focus on the challenges of teaching metacognition and talk about some recommended solutions that we've been thinking about over the last few months. There are 3 main ideas that we're going to cover, and those 3 ideas are the bias for action, which is a bias that both we as instructors and our students have. And then students aren't aware of the benefits of reflection, and students aren't adept at cognitive self-appraisal. So the first point is the bias for action, and this comes from the DiStefano article that we covered in the review of literature, but it refers to another study by Bar Eli and his team, and they are also in psychology, and they are studying the reaction of soccer goalkeepers, and they're studying that reaction in order to understand more about a perceived bias for action that we all have. And so basically what their study was they looked at professional goalkeepers on soccer teams around the world, and they studied their behavior specifically when they were faced with a penalty kick. So that situation where there's one kicker who has the ball, he's standing in front of the goalkeeper, and he's going to kick it right into the goal, and the goalkeeper is trying to defend the goal. And what they found is that only 6% of the time did the goalkeeper stay in the middle. Most of the time he would lunge to the left or the right. And the interesting thing about this is that when they studied how often the kickers, where they kicked, at least a third of the time the kickers kicked into the center. And then a good other percent of the time they kicked close enough to the center that really the smartest thing to do would be to stand still and take it from the center. But these goalies never do that. And they talked with them about it, and what they came up with was they didn't like the idea of standing still. It felt like they were doing nothing.
Well, that's kind of similar to what we do in the classroom, like when we ask a question, if we don't give the students even time to answer, we automatically fill in the space, because if we're just standing there looking at each other, that's like inaction.
That's right. And we have that same bias for action when we're carrying on discussions. And when I used to train the TAs, I remember we often talked about that hang time. You have to allow your students to have some hang time so they can think about how to answer a question or ask you to rephrase it before you answer it. And we all have a bias for action, which is the interesting thing the study shows. And they've replicated the study in other ways and come to find out that it seems to be a kind of a norm of the human psychology that we have this bias for action. And so DiStefano, in that article, they relate this to education and why we don't value reflection as much as we should as part of the learning process. And we always asking students to practice, to do an assignment, to write an essay, to finish take a test. And rarely do we have them stop and pause to think about that action that they did and what they got out of it. And so the bias for action leads us to not value reflection as an integral part of the learning process.
Because when students are reflecting, it looks like they're not doing anything, even though they are.
And we have this same idea as instructors about reflective writing and essays. We have a tendency to assign an essay, we might peer review it, move on, then do another essay, and we value the essays. And I've seen many syllabi in my years of consulting, and I rarely see very much value in terms of the grading scheme placed on reflective writing. The highest value is always placed on the essays. It's usually something like 75 to 85% essays, and then 10% for maybe journal writing and class participation. So if we really believe the studies from the first part where they talk about how reflection is a necessary part of learning, and that if you don't have reflection, learning doesn't take place, then we need to value reflection is part of the grading scheme of our course. The systematic reflection, along with the formula that we were talking about, asking students to describe and then assess their learning and give evidence. If they're doing that, they really are doing analytical, critical writing, and it's important writing, and so it should be valued within the curriculum.
And this way, by having it in the system on a regular basis, like you and I do, or of attaching it to every assignment as an integral part of every assignment, or in my case, as an integral part of every week's syllabi, every week's schedule, the students get used to seeing it as something that is important and connected to what they're doing.
Which segues perfectly into our next point, that students are often unaware of the benefits of reflection. And this is because, well, first of all, they haven't thought about reflection before, but also very importantly, they've rarely been asked to reflect on things before. Even though we know it's a very important part of the learning process, it's not valued by many instructors, and so students don't value it either. And we found in our study that we did together, where we not only did the survey with students, but then we followed up with some focus groups. We asked them, have you been asked to write reflectively? And even when we knew that they had been asked to write reflectively, they sometimes said no. They didn't understand that they were reflecting.
And this is part of the instructors might be asking questions that they consider reflection, but if it's not transparent to the student or not explained to the student, then the student isn't always aware of what they're being asked to do and doesn't really internalize this idea of reflecting on their own learning.
And that actually applies to many areas of our pedagogy, not just reflection, which I learned when I was reading recently. The Chronicle of Higher Education had an article called The Unwritten Rules of Higher Education, and it's one of the articles that we have put in the Dropbox to go along with this series that you can have a look at. But it's about a project at UNLV. Winklemas, who is in humanities, has volunteers from across the disciplines who are working to make their instructions to students more transparent and then measuring the effects of that. And they have found that the more transparent they are in the way they present their assignments to students in these three areas: what task you're asking them to do, why are you asking them to do it, the purpose, which is what we're getting at, the purpose for reflection, and then criteria, how they'll evaluate it. When the instructors do this, there is much more engagement from the students. I think they did it by higher grades, higher student satisfaction, and higher retention. So transparency in teaching and learning can be a benefit across your curriculum, not just in terms of making the reasons for reflection more transparent to your students.
It also makes it the process of reflecting easier if they already understand the purpose of the task that they are doing. So if the assignments are transparent, it makes the reflection itself easier to comprehend and carry through.
Yeah, and they come with this, we've talked about this before, they come with this consumer mentality about education where the teacher tells me what to do and I do it. And that's the only purpose that they see for why they do it. Why are you doing this paper? Well, because I have to do it or else I won't get a grade. There's no connection to actually learning, a purposeful learning that's attached to it. And so I think we often assume that they understand why we're having them do the things they're doing, but they don't. They do not understand why. And you have to tell them, and more than once, you have to actually repeatedly explain to them why they're doing something. And so one of the ways that I do that is I've made pretty much every week as part of my blog, I have a short little blurb about, remember, the reason that you're doing this weekly reflection is because it's a necessary component in your learning process, and that you have to analyze where you are and where you're progressing and where you still need to work in order to improve. Another thing that I have is, as an example of a way to make the reflection process, why we have them do reflecting, more transparent to them, is a short video that I made that I ask my students to watch the first week before they write their first blog. The video is part of the package in the Dropbox, and you can have a look at that and use it if you like. To wrap up the second section, our pedagogical solutions for students not being aware is to remind ourselves that we have to give direct instruction to them and repeated instruction on the benefits of why we're having them reflect. But not only reflect, but this is a good thing to do. The transparency is a good thing to do in terms of all of our curriculum. This relates to something we were talking about the other day, Kathy, in terms of looking at our own curriculum and making changes. because we need to reflect on our own teaching, because if we want to continue to improve, it's something that we also need to not just teach, but teach and then reflect, and that helps us improve and move on.
Basically, when we're talking about reflection, it's not just a student thing that we need to be encouraging students to reflect. As instructors, we often do not reflect enough on our own pedagogy and why we are giving certain assignments, and we're just giving assignments sometimes without thinking whether this particular class really needs that or why we're doing it for them to move on. So it needs to become integral in our own teaching process, in addition to making it part of the student process.
And I have made some changes to my own curriculum based on looking at it for this transparency. So I go back and say to myself, okay, why am I asking them to do this? Let me add some language in here to explain why we're doing it. And then I realize, you know what? I'm not sure why I'm making them do this. They don't need to do this. So, all right. Our last point is that students aren't particularly adept at cognitive self-appraisal. They're not so bad at narrating something they did, but looking at something they did and analyzing it and being able to make conclusions based on that is not something that they're particularly adept at. And we found in our study when we did the survey of student perceptions over the last 3 years, and we've had, over 2,000 students in this survey from 3 different years, we found that consistently students highly overrate their abilities when we look at that in terms of how the instructors are rating their abilities.
Yeah, you can see from the chart here, the blue is the students and the yellow are the instructors that we surveyed on the same questions. For example, how well their students understand the textbooks. If you look at the first one, and you can see that the students were very confident in their ability to understand textbooks, whereas their instructors gave them a much lower rating. And this was kind of across the board, except for the multiple choice test. They had similar perceptions, but across the board and all of the other components that we ask about, the students had a much higher confidence in their abilities than the instructors felt was being shown in how they demonstrated this knowledge in class.
And I remember the first time that we did this back in 2013, we were really surprised at just how highly they evaluated their skills, especially because some of these same students are in our classes that will write things in their blogs like, oh, I've never been good at writing, and I don't know, I have anxiety about this class. But then on the other hand, they're rating their skills in the 6s and 7s. And we actually defined those numbers for them in the study as 1 being, I'm not good at this at all and I need a lot of work. And 7 was, I'm a master of this and I don't need any further work in it. So that they were giving so many 6s and 7s is really an indicator of just how highly they were evaluating their skills.
We even clarified the survey as much as possible to make sure that it was crystal clear what they were answering to, that they were answering that they were highly confident. And then at the end of the 3 years, we had some group discussions with the students to ask them straight out about the questions. And yes, they were understanding the questions exactly as we had intended, and they were all very confident.
My favorite part of those focus groups that we did was at the end, we asked the students to read what we thought was a really easy to grasp excerpt. Like one was from Bill Gates, I remember, and it was really a rather simple thing. And we asked them to read it and ask if they understood it. Yes, they understood it. And then we asked them to paraphrase it. And I think only maybe 1 out of 10 could do it.
Yeah.
And again, we were surprised at they're confident, but they're not competent. And we've been wondering about some of the reasons for this over the last 3 years. And I ran across a study called the Dunning-Kruger effect that I think gives a beautiful explanation for why we're seeing some results like this and why students aren't particularly adept at self-appraisal. So this study started in 1999, but it's been replicated many, many times by many different other researchers. And basically what they concluded was that people who are incompetent or ignorant about a particular area of knowledge, they don't recognize, even more so, they can't recognize their incompetence. And so basically, instead of being disoriented or perplexed about being incompetent, they actually have a very high confidence about what they feel like they understand. And so it's this idea of they don't know what they don't know.
And this is not just talking about incompetent people or you might be thinking, dumb people. This is talking about the population in general, because pretty much everyone has different types of skills, different areas of knowledge. And they found in this effect that as a general rule, people, particularly in the 75% lower side of the scale in any given component of knowledge, had more confidence in their knowledge than they actually could demonstrate.
That's right. In any one particular situation, the less you knew about something, the more highly you were likely to overestimate your ability. Whereas the blue and the red lines, the more that people actually knew about the topic, the closer they were to actually getting their skills on target of where they actually were. So I think this is really a great explanation for why our students who don't really understand, we were asking them, how easy do you find it to understand your textbooks? How easy do you find it to build a strong thesis? How easy do you find it to marshal evidence to back up that thesis? They're like, that's easy. Oh, yeah, I'm 6 at that. I'm 7 at that. Because they don't even know that they don't know how to make a strong thesis. They don't know enough about what a strong thesis is to be able to say truthfully how good they are at that.
Another thing that was pointed out in this study is even when someone comes in and contradicts their knowledge, like an instructor, that if it doesn't fit with their own perception of their abilities, that there is a tendency to naturally disregard it. And so this is one thing that we felt was important regarding reflection, is that students have this way of actually internalizing, of thinking about, reflecting on what they know, instead of just automatically disregarding anything that contradicts with what they think they know.
And that actually is going to tie in really well when I start talking about Learn, Smart, Achieve in a few minutes. One of the great things about using Learn, Smart, Achieve as part of teaching students to be more reflective is they have data to back up what they did. So it's not a teacher saying, you need to work on this, and they can just dismiss that and she doesn't like me or she's looking for something wrong. It's data showing them that can actually change their minds about where they are and give them a clearer idea of where they are. So to go along with the Dunning-Kruger effect, there are several other studies, and these are all mentioned by the Paris and Winograd article. One of them I found really interesting was the Markman and Gorin one, where they asked students to read a passage or had a passage read out loud to the student and asked them, do you understand this? And they would rate how well they felt they understood it. And then they would ask them questions to find out how much they really did understand it. And basically what the study found was that the students were always pretty confident that they understood the text. But then when they were answering questions, it was obvious that they didn't. And we pretty much replicated this with our own study when we gave them the short little excerpts and then asked them to paraphrase them. Then Wagner did one specifically with reading theory and showed that students often have an illusion of comprehension after they've read something because they don't monitor their knowledge, or they don't monitor, did I understand that or did I not? They just read it and they say, I got it. And so because they're not in the habit of reflecting and being critical about their own learning process, they often misperceive what they understand.
And this is even escalated when students are coming from diverse places or different parts of the world and so on, where they might automatically attach a concept that they had from before to words that they're seeing now. And they haven't really thought about whether this is the same type of situation in this new place they are. So as our population is diverse, this is only escalated.
And another thing that will often happen when they have misperceptions of what they're getting, when you ask them to do reflective writing, what you'll get is what I've come to call a narrative of progress. And here's an example of one. So it's a student who feels pretty good about what he's accomplished, but there's really not much evidence there that he's accomplished much at all. So as you read through this, you can see it's almost like he's checking off a list. Yep, we did Connect assignments and those were helpful. Yep, we did essays, they were a challenge. Check, got through them. Slowly getting a better handle on my grammar, better at critical reading. So he's just checking off a list of things he's done. He's not really able yet to look at his own progress with a critical eye and have anything to say about it. All he can really do is narrate it. But when they do get
analysis.
Right. But when they do get to the point where they can look at their own thinking, they've done enough reflection to where they understand it to the point where they've internalized it to where they really can analyze their learning process by looking back at it and pausing and looking back at it. They can give you something like this one where the student is showing me his progress with details. And you can see very clearly in this one how the student is following that formula that I've talked about, how I asked them to describe the thing that they did, assess their learning based on a course objective, and then give evidence. So he starts by saying, I made progress in terms of learning to write with specifics and in a more formal tone. And those are two objectives that come right off of my rubric for one of the essays, the essay that he's writing about. And he shows, here's my first draft, and this is what I wrote. And then he says, I came back and looked at it and realized it's vague and it's not very formal. And so here's how I revised it. So he's showing I understood this course objective and I can look back over my own work and see where I've made progress by looking at the evidence of my own work.
And the nice thing about this is it really helps us to see that the student has understood what the course objective was in the first place, because many times they just kind of see these as words, something that the instructor has. But when they are asked to reflect on it, then they actually have to understand what the course objective is.
I want to come back to something we were talking about earlier in terms of students not understanding where they are. And one of the ways that you can help students get a much clearer, more accurate handle on where they are and where they need help is with a tool like Connect that gives a lot of dense and detailed data reports, not only to the instructor, but also to the student. And so what I would like to show you right now is very quickly a tool called Learn, Smart, Achieve in Connect, and the way that reflection is built into that tool. So here I am in a module from Learn, Smart, Achieve. I'm in a module that covers plagiarism, patch writing, and common knowledge. Here are the objectives that have been assigned for this practice session. Learn Smart is an adaptive tool in that it figures out what a student knows and doesn't know about specific objectives that you've assigned for them to practice on, and then it works with them interactively on those objectives until they have a good understanding of all of the objectives that you've assigned. After answering a question, the student always has to choose a confidence level. I know it, I think so, I'm unsure, I have no idea. These actually act in a way to build reflection into every single question, where the student not only has to answer the question, but also make a judgment call on how well he or she understands the material. When a student gets a question incorrect, the system tells her right away that she's incorrect and what the correct answer is, and then moves on. After answering several questions incorrectly, the system will give the student some information to read that will help him answer the questions correctly the next time he sees questions about that same objective. What's important for our purposes here is that at any point during this session, the student can come in and look at his reports and see the data accruing based on the work that he's been doing. So I've spent 4 minutes on this particular module and I'm 33% of the way done. I can look at the most challenging learning objectives. So these are the learning objectives that I've missed more than one question on. If I don't understand what one of these objectives means, I can click on it and Connect will show me an example of a question that's tagged for that particular objective. I can also look at the questions that I missed. So here are questions that I've missed in the last session that I've been in, and I can click on the question and I can try to answer it again and see if I got it correct this time. And then this one is the report that I ask my students to spend some time thinking about. This is the combination of their accuracy and their competence. So if they have a high percentage here on the top of where they knew the answer, that's really great news. I tell them that means not only do they understand the information, but they have a good level of confidence about what they know. And what that means is that they should be able to start transferring this knowledge over into their writing when they're thinking about writing and when they're revising and when they're looking at other people's writing. And then here in the middle we have aware you didn't know the answer, unaware that you knew the answer. These both show that there's some difference between what you know and what you think you know. And the one on the bottom is the one that I tell students is a red flag if it's higher than 20 or 25%. Basically what that means is that you think you know a lot more about this topic than you actually do. You've been saying I know it, and you've been getting the answer wrong in a high percentage of the time. And this means that you probably need more practice with this topic before you become more confident with it. So to go along with asking students to not only do the practice, but then look at their reports, again, to get them to then pause on the practice they've done and reflect on it, I ask them at least once during the term to write a blog that's about the work they did in Connect. And I ask them to look at several different data reports that they've been given as students and summarize the reports and then reflect on what they learned from reading their own data. So it's, again, reflection, but giving them very specific focus. So here's a student who's looking at the amount of time it took him to finish one of the practice sessions, and it took him an inordinately longer amount of time than it should have. And it seems kind of silly to us that this is his realization, but sometimes this is the realization students need to have. He says, if I paid more attention, I would get done faster and I would understand more.
That's what we all want to hear from the students.
And then here's a student that I like her reflection, and this is from my end of the term essay where I asked them to write an essay that reflects on the whole term. And they can look back over their blogs if they want to and use snippets from their blogs. In fact, I asked them to look at their blogs as they're thinking about their progress, their blogs kind of being their progress as it has occurred. And then at the end of the term, they're looking at that and kind of putting it all together into an essay. And I asked them at some point in the essay to write about data that they've looked at in Connect. So this student shows me here a screenshot of the report that tells her how often she was aware that she knew the answer and how often she said, I know it, but she actually got the answer wrong. So for semicolons, she actually answered all of the questions correctly right out of the gate. She said, I know it, and she got them all right. And so she actually does understand the concept of when to use a semicolon and when not to. And the really interesting thing to me about this particular reflection is the bottom here that I have bolded, where she says, now that I know, now that I'm confident about using semicolons, I'm going to use them more often in my writing. So here we see that transfer happening. As we were talking about in the review of the literature, that if students reflect on their learning, they'll be able to transfer that learning into other situations. So here she's going to transfer it from doing the practice session at Connect into writing the essays.
And the nice thing about this data is that the students probably are less likely to disregard it because it's like cold facts based on questions they have personally answered. And so there would, for the students who are overly confident, there would be less likelihood of them disregarding it. And for students like this who might be lacking confidence, it is building their confidence enough to continue using what they've learned and reflected on.
I agree. And it's one of the ways that technology can help us to do something that we haven't ever been able to do before, because with the number of students that we have to teach and everything else that we have to do, there's no way that we could give students this kind of data from ourselves. But because they're using a system that tracks what they do and tabulates it and then gives them all of this data, it's something that we can give them that they wouldn't otherwise have. And one thing I've noticed is that my students really like looking at this data, and often I'll see that Dunning-Kruger effect take place because early in the term when I ask them to rate themselves on their usage of grammar and writing and reading, And quite often they're pretty confident. But then after they've done a practice session, I will often see them write things like, well, I thought I knew more about this than I actually did. And as you say, they're more willing to take it because it's cold hard facts to them.
Subjectivity, and students generally, at least my writing students, have generally had seem to have a bigger respect for science and facts than the subjectivity of writing instructors.
That's right. Okay, so to wrap up this last point, the pedagogical solutions we're recommending are systematic instructions on how to write those reflections. And again, this is a virtuous circle because the more systematic you are in training them how to be reflective, not just narrate, but also critically analyze. They're doing critical thinking and they're writing analysis, which makes you feel all the much better about making this being a valuable part of your curriculum. And then also use technology for what it's good for. When there are technologies like Learn Smart, Achieve from Connect, those are the kinds of things that you can use to increase your students' ability to think metacognitively about what they're doing in their class. So to recap, we looked at bias for action, students being unaware of the benefits, and how to overcome their inability to do really deep thinking and cognitive self-appraisal. And I know I, for one, have learned so much from our research together, Kathy, and I thank you again for hanging out with me to do this video series and talk about some of the things we've been thinking about. I know both of us are ready to do a lot more experimentation and learn more about how we can make reflection and metacognition really effective in our classrooms. And I'm looking forward.
And in addition, it helps us also to become reflectors, and it helps us in another way that it gives us a window into our students' minds as they're thinking about their own learning. And many times when I'm asking them to reflect, I realize things that they talk about in their blogs that I didn't realize that was an issue causing a difficulty for the student. Like they will bring up that they had been taught a different way, and I might not have even thought about this. So I think reflection also helps us as instructors.
Very well said, and comes back to this John Dewey quote we have here. We don't learn to be better teachers from just teaching without reflecting. When we're reflective teachers, we can continue to improve that area of our lives as well. So this is something that's important for both us and our students. All right, thanks again, and that's the end of part 2.